Hey everyone. I have read the wiki entries that you made for your leadership books and your discussion boards and have given you feedback in the rubric in Blackboard for your review. Just a brief comment about the wikis. It is important that as leaders or aspiring leaders, depending on where you are in your practice, that you find ways to continue to develop and to grow. One of those ways is to immerse yourself in leadership literature. And I don't mean necessarily scholarly literature, but actually the genre of books. There are so many really good leaders who have written some fabulous books. Many of you have touched on several of those books and have added those to the wiki. I'll clean that wiki up and put out a reading list for you to look at from your from your peers' perspectives and get that out to you. So I appreciate your time in doing that. If you're not a reader, I'm going to encourage you to think about doing podcasts or even the TED Talks that deal with leadership. Lots of ways that we can get informal instruction and role modeling and mentoring through an online world or through reading to grow. And sometimes we just don't have time to immerse ourselves in literature, and we don't have time to read a 300-page book. But we do have 10 or 15 minutes each day to try to find a way to connect with our leadership development. So one of the reasons in having you do that wiki is, one, to make sure you're doing it, and two, kind of to create a list of books for you to choose from, and maybe look at a list of books that you haven't thought about as leadership material. Your discussion board on fractals was fantastic. I always get excited to see how people will think about the concept of fractals and how they apply it to everyday life. I think it was Gail. Big shout out to Gail, who connected fractals with cauliflower and cauliflower with hospital organizations. I can honestly say, Gail, I have never heard that analogy before, and you made it make perfect sense. It'd be great to kind of figure out some way to put that on a poster somewhere, or some way to get it out there, because I think a lot of people would look at a head of cauliflower completely different at this point. So I appreciate the approach, the unique approach to that. Your colleague Susan did a really nice job connecting the biblical worldview with the concept of fractals. Susan wrote that in the Bible, the term church can refer to both the universal church, which includes all saints, and the local physical church. This is a fractal where the parts are similar to the whole. The Bible tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 26, and if one must suffer, all the members suffer with it, or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. This one verse seems to best describe fractals in a biblical sense because it seems to infer that what happens to one happens to the group, and a group is made up of like individuals. This author must admit that once one understands the term fractal and begins to observe the world around them, that they must admit that the world is made up of fractals, and the simplicity and the complexity of those fractals is simply amazing. And I think Susan did a lovely job of pointing out one of the reasons I have this assignment in this course is because the concept of fractals we can apply to our Christian worldview, but we can apply to organizational worldviews. And as Gail has taught us, we can also apply it to cauliflower. So well done with that. Just some tips on APA that came through in your work this week. I want to remind you that in a graduate level course, you should be synthesizing what you are reading in your articles and in your scholarly sources. Make sure that instead of doing a direct quote, that you think about what you've read that you think is quote worthy. Think about how it relates to the content that you're discussing, and synthesize what the author said, which basically means to write, this is what the author said in your own words, and how it relates to the topic that you're discussing. That level of thinking is really important at the graduate level, so I want you to practice doing that and to avoid direct quotes. From quoting the Bible, there are lots of ways to approach this. My encouragement is that there are, when you're asked or when you feel led to share something that is biblically based, that you provide the meaning of the verse or verses that you want to share in your work, and paraphrase those as well. God wants us to be in the Bible. He wants us to be reading His Word and understanding the words that we're given. But he also wants us to be able to say, I've read this and this is how I find meaning in my life. I think he'd be okay with us paraphrasing what we're learning, the stories, the lessons, the value of biblical referencing. If you feel like that's not something you're comfortable with, I'm okay with direct quotes from short verses from the Bible. I would encourage you not to quote multiple verses, because you really do distract your reader by putting bulk quotes, especially when they get lengthy and unwieldy in the body of your work. So if you do want to use, there's something very poignant that you're pulling out from the Bible, that's okay, but just make sure you're embedding it in a sentence. It's not graduate level writing to just put quotes and drop a verse in and then not connect it to something. You should introduce that verse with, the book of Mark tells us, comma, quote, and then fill in your direct quote. That I can live in that world. It's not fabulous, but I can live in that world if that's your preference. Just know that you should not be just dropping Bible verses in the body of a paragraph without connecting it and embedding it in a sentence. That's just grammatically appropriate. So, DOIs and URLs. Make sure that in all of your articles that you have a DOI. And if you are not able to find a DOI, go back and make sure that the source you're using is a scholarly source. The DOI is a way of us knowing that it is a scholarly source, because it will be properly organized and be a component of an organized system. Doesn't mean it isn't a scholarly source without a DOI, but you do want to raise your eye and go back and just double check that it is from a peer-reviewed scholarly source before you move forward. Now, if you're sure that it's a scholarly source and it doesn't have a DOI, then you need to copy the URL within the database that you got it. So if you go into the Jerry Falwell Library, you go into Ovid and you find an article and you click and you copy the URL where it came from and you drop it into your reference list, you're going to have a ton of lines of embedded coding. You want to back up that URL to probably a line or two, no more than 2 lines. Normally we say back it up into the search engine that you use. So if you used Ovid or EBSCO or CINAHL, back it up at least to there, no further than there. We want to know what database you use so we can find it that way. But you do need to provide a DOI or a URL, and it should be an abbreviated URL. Now, next week, you've got your part 1 of your quality project. I'm going to encourage you to read part 1 and part 2 assignments. You want to connect. This piece of it is a scholarly paper. The second part of it is a voiceover PowerPoint that you are going to present information that you've learned about the quality issue. You're going to describe the quality issue and its impact in part 1. And in part 2, you're going to make a recommendation based on your own search of the literature of a new way to approach the problem. So, part 1 is, this is the problem, this is how I know it's a problem, this is how big the problem is, this is what we're currently doing about the problem. Part 2 is a brief summary of that, and then your approach is going to be, this is what we're doing, but I think we should be doing this instead. Or, in addition to what we're doing, we should be doing this because, and here's the evidence. So if you're picking a problem that's currently going along swimmingly and you're fixing it, you're not going to have a part 2. So really think about your practice area and think about the things that are on the radar, things that everybody's worried about, things that you're doing initiatives to solve. And really think about one thing that you want to focus on and offer an innovative, novel, evidence-based solution for in part 2. So I want you to approach this together and think thoughtfully about what this looks like for both parts of it. When you write your paper, I want to remind you that this is a scholarly paper. You should be using level 1, level 2, and probably level 3 APA headings. Your reference list should be filled with scholarly sources. You're going to want to avoid editorials, commentaries, sources that are not peer-reviewed. So this is kind of your first stab at writing a strong paper. So I do want you to focus on content, but I also want you to focus on proper formatting and proper writing. One of the goals for you prior to your graduation is that you will be a scholarly writer. Even if you are so over APA and you never want to see APA again, you still need to have the skills to structure and follow a proper format for writing. So please work on polishing those skills. Checking my notes. Oh, I think that's it. Know that I'm here. If you go through your work and you have questions or you're not sure, please send me an email. Know that the Ask the Professor link is for general questions like where do I find, or what can I do, or what should I do with this. Excuse me. Email me with direct questions or concerns, and know that I will respond appropriately to whatever venue you reach out to me. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. I'll be praying for you and thinking about you. Take care.